Now, I'm absolutely delighted to be able to introduce Dame Jackie Daniel. Jackie is the Chief Executive of the Newcastle Hospital Foundation Trust and is a very close and important partner for us here at the university. She has a long and distinguished career in the NHS and many national leadership roles. Jackie, we're delighted to be working with you on this project, and I'll hand over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jane, and hello everyone. It has been an absolute privilege, I have to say, to be engaged in this bit of work. And as Jane says, I'll give you a bit of an update about where we're at. I think there's so much more to do on it. And but at its heart, there are two influential organisations, the Civic University Network and also the NHS Confederation, who've been hosting a series of conversations really to explore how universities and the NHS can work together in place. So the areas that we've been interested in terms of the conversation, you can see here up on the slide. So, how can universities and the NHS work together to deliver real collective benefits to the society that they serve, and in particular to the local economy. We've also been asking ourselves, what roles should universities play in newly emerging integrated care systems that are going to be a really important certainly part of the health and care landscape. What role should the NHS play in the UK's research and development roadmap? And making sure really that the NHS and universities remain central to the national conversations that are all important now, particularly given a year of the pandemic that we've had across the country as a whole. So next slide, please. So we've had a lot of discussion, it's fair to say. We started with an initial webinar in November 2020, where I think it's fair to say, just kind of wrestled around with the whole question about how we reimagine the relationship. And I think that really helped us set up then 3 roundtables, which followed in quick succession. And you can see there some of the people engaged in the discussions. It's been people that have been close to the NHS and to university sector. So it's been really, really rich thus far. Next slide, please. Now, before I share with you some of the themes that are coming, that come out of that work, I wanted just to give you a little bit of a glimpse into a local story, a story that is close to my heart and certainly close to Jane's heart here in Newcastle, because I hope this will give you a little bit of a vignette, if you like, into some of the examples. This is very like some of the examples that we heard about. So in Newcastle, the civic organisations, if you like, have been working together really over the last 3 years or so to improve the health, the wealth and well-being of our population. In my mind now, these 3 words are so inextricably linked, and I think we feel that in Collaborative Newcastle. So the cornerstone of the collaboration really is, the City Council, Newcastle University and ourselves as a major teaching trust. You can see from that slide that there's lots of other partners engaged as well. There are other NHS partners. We've got a large mental health provider. We have got a lot of engagement with our general practice, our commissioners, but also with local enterprise and the business sector and the voluntary sector also. So next slide, please. What have we been up to? Well, you might know that, I'm very proud to lead an organisation which has been twice rated outstanding by the Care Quality Commission, and we're really high performing. But if you know anything about the North East, you will know that around us, we've got a backdrop that goes back, a long way in terms of inequality and a lot of deprivation in actual fact. So we want to improve health outcomes, of course, but we also want to drive up and improve our economic prospects. So if we just take the bottom bullet point on that slide, we've been in place really trying to integrate health and care delivery as much as possible. We've developed a really good model, which is very deep in place and very broad as well, with all of those partners that I've just talked about. We've got a lot of joint infrastructure and investment. We've moved money around to do some quite innovative things for our populations. And we've developed a very strong governance and leadership structure, which just helps us work within that kind of context with ease, really. One of the great examples that we've done is the third bullet point there, redeveloped a huge pocket of land really at the west of our city. It did belong to the NHS. It was an old hospital site. We sold it to the university, but now we're redeveloping it together. And this is, we've got great ambitions. This is going to be a go-to place really for innovation, for evaluation and dissemination of new technologies, and also lifestyle approaches for older people. But it'll also obviously create a vibrant pocket of space in the city, which is really, really much needed in quite a deprived area. Recently, we've created what we call ICHNI, our Integrated COVID Lab Northeast. We built on the river the largest testing laboratory in the country at the moment. But we didn't want to just build a laboratory. We've done this in partnership, could only do it in partnership. You know, created 900 jobs, which was fantastic for our local economy and those people, giving them new opportunities to enter into health provision. But we've also developed what we call an innovation lab. And at the moment, we're really at the forefront of looking at new variants, but testing new technologies, working with local business, which again, we think will have what are probably obvious spin-outs. And then we were very, very proud to bid and to be awarded Academic Health Science Centre status quite recently. I think this is quite unique because, you know, the local authority are there as a core partner. And I've got great hopes for what we'll do in that space, particularly around things like digital and data science, that I think we can advance, you know, a lot around population health management and, again, dealing with some of the inequalities that are at the heart of some of our communities. So next slide, please. So the example I shared with you there, you know, you can imagine in these discussions, we had lots of examples from all across the country about small projects, large scale projects that were happening, but there were some really important themes coming out, and I'll just take you through them. So the first one was around, you know, collaboration and co-development. We heard a lot about that, how important it was, particularly in the context of recovery from this pandemic and moving forward, that we need to really accelerate progress in order to handle that. But there was a lot said about the importance of trust and the importance of developing relationships, and that obviously takes time to build. But we heard a lot about the common values between the aspirations and ambition of universities and the NHS and of other partners, that actually we all want to come together to create better lives for ourselves, our families and our communities. So the next theme then was our role as anchor institutions. I mean, I mentioned some of the examples in my slide. You know, I lead a large organisation. We've got 17,000 staff. We're about 1.3 billion turnover, but we spend 420 odd million every year. Now, for every pound that we can spend more locally, you can imagine what that does for local employment and for our economy. It's great for health and well-being. There are some obvious links there. But the other area we heard a lot about is the common purpose we all have around the net zero agenda and sustainability. And actually together, there were lots of examples through the discussions of areas where people felt they could go so much further working together in terms of the net zero agenda. So the next theme we heard about was building the future. The really important role that we all play in terms of creating opportunities, developing the workforces of the future. You know, universities have obviously got a long-standing, you know, core purpose. But again, together, the way that we could widen those opportunities in so many ways. So the fourth theme, and this for me is so important. You've heard me talk about the inequalities in the city region I work in, but this was a really common theme about, you know, that we can be so much greater than the sum of our parts. And I guess this really plays at the heart of the connectivity between health, wealth, and well-being. The next example, next theme that came through was all about how we work beyond our own institutions. I mean, it was for many, many years. I've been in health for about 40 years. I've been a chief executive for 20 of those. And it's, you know, my job is now no longer just simply about running good hospitals and good healthcare. I think we've got an obligation, we've got accountability to think about how we work together in place to have that bigger impact. I call it creating sticky edges on which to get greater leverage and accelerate pace, be a forceful, you know, bigger, broader good, if you like. We heard a lot about that. And then finally, we just had so many examples of great practice and just how much innovation is out there, and that we definitely needed to collect that, share it, demonstrate, support one another to be the best that we can be in this space. So that was wonderful. And I think as we go on, as we move on from here, so if we go on to the next slide, what we really want to do through conversations like this, the one that we'll have through the chat and polling that we'll come on to, and during the panel discussion, I think we want to test those findings. We want to build on the examples that we've heard of best practice and share the blueprint of these principles at the NHS Confederation coming up in June, and obviously here today. So, you know, it's a real opportunity to reconnect leadership across these big civic important organisations and enable more discussion at regional level and at local level, perhaps around some of the themes that are emerging. So it's an iterative process that's far from complete, and I'm really looking forward to hearing your input and building on where we've gotten to so far. And it will be really, really important in health. It is all now about systems. It's all about working collaboratively. And so what we're learning here, I hope, will really, really influence the way that these systems move on and develop. So Michael, I think I'll hand over to you now to take us into the next piece of this session. Thank you.
Thanks, Jackie. That was excellent. Good morning, everyone. Michael Wood from the NHS Confederation, and it's been fantastic to be involved in this piece of work. As Jackie said, not only important but timely, actually, and timely for both sectors, which I think is fantastic. We've got just under an hour now, plenty of time to get under the bonnet of some of what we've heard. I'm going to bring in three partners for our panel to join Jackie. We've got Helen Goulden, Chief Executive of the Young Foundation, Dr. Fazana Hussain, GP and Clinical Director from a primary care network in Newham, and Professor Shirley Condon, the Vice Chancellor of the University of Bradford. And what's fantastic, all our panelists have joined at least one of the sessions, the roundtables we've held. I'm going to just kick off some questions for the panel. Please do get your questions coming in. We want your questions for the panel. We want some comments on what you've heard. We want your case studies, and we've got plenty of time for that. We're going to have a few polls as well. We'll intersperse the panel discussion with a few polls. We'll see how they go. But first of all, I'm going to just ask for Shirley, Farzana and Helen, in that order, just your reflections from being involved in this piece of work to date, and perhaps one thing that stood out for you. Shirley, if I can come to you first.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. So I think for me, I was part of two of the roundtable discussions, and what struck me was the level of commitment and the determination for partners to want to work in a much more intentional way with one another. And as Jackie referred to, the importance of realising that we share many values and that we all want to be driving health and well-being up. And how we do that came across very strongly to me as, you know, we've got a lot of commitment to want to work in system leadership, but what's not so clear is how we do that. And there was also evidence in the panels that I joined in that there is huge variability in the level of development that people have across the UK in how well these partnerships have been advanced and developed and integrated. So I think the intention's there, the commitment's there, but I think how we embed this deliberately going forward is one of the key things that I'm interested in.
Thanks, Shirley. And that really points, doesn't it, to the next steps. And I think, you know, what this blueprint looks like and how we might support leaders locally on the ground to embed it. Farzana, please.
Thank you, Michael, and good morning, everybody. I think for me, it was exciting to think that this is happening because we talk a lot about collaboration, but of course, as a GP, as a clinical director, looking after 67,000 of our residents in an East End place in London, even seeing what's happening nationally in my role as co-chair, we, as Shirley says, to embed that is still a challenge. And you know, I've spent 20 years as a GP where often we make the mistake of thinking that health is just the absence of disease. So actually when Jackie talks about health, wealth and well-being, and never has it been more important than at this time when we're looking at living through a pandemic and jobs being lost and all of those things. So what a great potential. And actually until a few months ago when I had the opportunity to be part of this, I would never have thought about it. You know, my connection with the university, he was teaching some medical students, and I hadn't really thought about the huge potential that there is. So I'm really excited that that awareness is being raised and that, you know, people like me can tell other people on the ground. So that is a huge start. I appreciate, you know, as Shirley said, the how we do it, we're still thinking about, but Jackie's work and, you know, the work in Newcastle is an amazing blueprint. But I think it's really positive that we're thinking about these things, and such a lot of potential with this really strong partnership of two very big anchors in our society.
Thanks, Farzana. And it was brilliant to have the primary care voice, I think, running throughout the roundtables. And we might come back to that issue about primary care university relationship. Helen, please.
Well, thanks, Michael. And as someone who's not a member of an NHS organisation or a university, but a sort of so-called sector, thank you for inviting us in. It's great to be here. And I did attend one of the sessions, and the overall reflection I had was probably two reflections. One is that the conversation started with what I consider to be like huge appetite, as Shirley and Farzana said, right? Real commitment and appetite for working not just across two different organisations or institutions, but more systemically and across lots of different anchor organisations, and equitably involving communities and bringing creative partnerships. And so it started with quite a lot of sort of, yes, this is great. And then a sort of like a more sobering bit of the meeting, which was essentially, and this is my reflection, whether this is others, I'm not sure, but actually that sounds quite difficult. How do you get too big, if not many more organisations with their own rhythms and priorities and governance and processes and cultures to take new, effortful forms of action that they're not massively used to? And that took us to a sort of thing of, well, actually, that's quite difficult. And what are the methods? Are there the methods, processes, indications of what kind of behaviours and competences you need in order to do that? So I think there are lots of examples, and we did hear lots, it's true. But whether we've got, when it comes to Shirley's point about the how of implementation, it feels to me there are sort of more dynamic forms of learning and exchange that need to happen across those partnerships, as well as laterally across different places, if we're to really sort of learn together and take quick forms of action, but also strategic long-term views. And I think one of my last point would be, I really love the examples, and I'm often led really wanting to know what the real truth is, like the dirty, nitty gritty, the bits that went wrong. And so I think if we can get beyond the heroic case study as a form of learning with each other, I think we'll probably come quite a long way.
Thank you, Helen. And I have to say, it was a fantastic sense check to have those partners in a room, such as yourself, Helen, who could bring the non-NHS, non-university perspective. And when you spoke about community engagement, that straight away, that spoke to where we perhaps need to improve as how big statutory organisations work. I'm just going to bring up the first poll, and we'll see how this goes. And this poll is, it's just a sense check of perhaps our relationships locally, how they feel. So if I ask the team to bring it up, and please, if you're joining, just answer the question. As soon as you've answered the question, it will disappear and we can bring up the results. So we should see a poll at some point about how you rate your local NHS university relationships. I'm sure that's coming up at, there we have, perfect. So if you just answer this, and then once you've answered it, and be honest, I'm sure the results will tell, then it will disappear, and at some point soon we'll get the results. There's a lot you can learn from these polls. There's a lot you can't learn from these polls. It might be that you're in a local place where there's numerous NHS organisations. Jackie's spoken about Collaborative Newcastle, bringing in not just a big teaching hospital, but the mental health trust. We've got primary care here as well. So that's just a bellwether to help us, and the results will be pulled up anytime now. Jackie, you ran through 6 of those principles. Any one that is particularly close to your heart, either because Collaborative Newcastle showed you that this is, if not the most important, then the one you need to work hardest on? Are any of those 6 you would pull out and say, this is the cornerstone of the new relationship?
I think for me, probably for the reasons, we'll all have different contexts, won't we, locally, but the inclusivity one for me had to be the kind of key focal point. It gives us our sort of true north, if you like, in terms of, that if, it's okay. I've talked about the outstanding rating, but it is no good at being outstanding. We've got a lovely picture of the metro map in Newcastle. We're fortunate enough to have a great metro. But lives lived without extensive comorbidities can be such a different pattern within sort of a few minutes on that metro journey, and that can't be right. So I keep saying, well, it's fine for me to be doing what we're doing, but unless we're changing some of those broader dials together, and I think we can really only do them together. Helen, you made me smile when you were talking about the kind of get down and dirty, what really goes on behind the scenes. I think for the reasons that you were speaking about there, Michael, it's not easy. None of this is, we shouldn't pretend, I certainly don't want Collaborative Newcastle to look like one of those heroic examples, because it is really hard. It means giving things up. It means actually having to, take second place and not this kind of jockeying for position, because with large organizations those power struggles are just so unproductive. So we've certainly been through some interesting conversations on the journey, but yeah, I think it's the inclusivity and the inequalities and levelling up for me, Michael.
Thanks, Jackie. Before I go just across to Shirley to talk about Bradford, can we have the results of the first poll, please? There we go. So that's the middle of the road, I think, isn't it? So and again, there's lots of information we can't behind this, and actually hopefully throughout our report, and particularly I guess when we go to look at what it might look like locally, we'll unpick some of this. But relatively strong relationships in the country. I think that looking at this, I think it shows the potential of what we can achieve and how we can bring our two huge anchors more closer together. So thanks for that first poll. Shirley, in Bradford's one of those places, rather like Newcastle, I often feel I'm getting a consistent response when I speak to, whether it's yourself or Mel Pickup at the local acute trust or Kirsten at the council. And that can't be an easy thing, a cultural thing to bring together, but it's a fantastically mature sign. Which of the themes struck you as being most relevant to your story in Bradford?
Well, it's the same as Jackie, really. It's got to be social mobility. And we're not going to have social mobility if we can't address the poverty, which is impacting structural issues on health and well-being on our local populations. And whether it's Newcastle, Bradford, Bolton, wherever, a lot of cities are sharing the same issues, which are increasing levels of poverty, people working in poverty. And really, if we want the health outcomes to be better, the only way we can work together is to not just undertake more applied research, learn from the applied research that's already been undertaken, but deliver impact. So for me, the success that we're starting to see in Bradford, working as a strong system leadership, is because we've taken the bold decision, or some people took a bold decision many, many years ago, to pin the flag on applied health research, to learn what the causes were of these inequalities right across the city, but not just only learn, but find solutions. And those solutions, through working as an integrated system, have found their way into local policy. It hasn't been easy, and it has relied on people being challenged in leadership positions to not just look inwards on their own organisation and not to try and worry where resources might be going, but to work collaboratively. But, you know, somebody said, I can't think who it was very recently, and many people have repeated it, that levelling up will only work if you can keep the brightest, some of the brightest people in your own area. And what we see in these areas of low deprivation is that people leave. And you know, we want people to return if they go and contribute. So for me, it's levelling up and social mobility.
Thank you, Shirley. I'm going to bring Fazana in, and then before we pass to Helen, we're going to have a next poll about the themes. Fazana, fascinating from a primary care perspective in you know, what you thought of the themes in this piece of work, you know, and we look at collaboration and co-development, for example, which is something as a clinical director you're focused on at the moment with your primary care professionals, let alone then facing out into universities and other partners. Any one theme that particularly struck you as being relevant for your place and your role?
I think, Michael, it was the first one, the collaboration and co-development, and to Helen's point, actually, you know, this is particularly for primary care and the construct of the primary care network. We are here for our populations, we're here for our communities. The size of our networks, you know, mine is a slightly larger network of 67,000, but very much part of the community, and it's the same skills and requirements that are needed to partner up with our civic universities, as it is to partner up with our local authority. Really interesting question from Ingrid in the questions and answers about the, you know, the ICS. As Jackie says, none of this is easy, and I'm so optimistic that actually, if Jackie can do this with this massive organisation, and let's face it, in primary care we always do say that acute trust's not going to move. They're massive. It's like trying to move a juggernaut. So actually, if they can do it, we can all do it. We are much closer, you know, as Helen says, to that down and dirty on the ground. This is very relevant for me because I see patients a couple of times a week saying, you know, we are in generations of poverty. You know, we don't know how to get out of this. Giving them some antidepressants isn't going to solve it. So we know that this is really important if we're going to try and improve health for our communities. This is absolutely essential. And while we're collaborating with everybody else, why not? This is the greatest opportunity. It's about how we get that message to our integrated care systems, who are obviously serving a much larger population, and looking at work that Jackie's doing, Shirley's doing, where I am in East London, you know, this is a great start for us. And so I think we should be really optimistic, because it will require the same skills. And the main thing is, for me, collaboration and co-development, and not worry about who's the GP and who's the this one and who's the that one. What is our shared purpose? Because this is about our populations.
That's excellent, Fazana, thanks. And we'll definitely come on to the integrated care system question. It's a great one. And I like it, that facing the juggernaut of the hospital, but you also face the juggernaut of the university, don't you? You know, and I think it's of primary care, fascinating perspective there. Before I ask Helen, we're just going to run the next poll, which is just asking people on the call just to highlight their 2 most important themes from what they've heard. And then once we've ticked that and voted, so I'm going to vote as well, then wonderful. Helen, can I please ask you just to pick one theme? I mean, it might be building on what you've already said before, but if I just ask you to pick one theme and then...
Yeah, I think I would have to sort of, I mean, there's much to explore and unpack with all of them, isn't there? But I think I agree with the focus on inclusivity and the kind of building the future, levelling up theme. I think, Jackie, your point about you've got some fantastic high-performing institutions and really high standards of excellence nestled within some of the highest areas of deprivation. That's so instructive. That tells us so much. It's such a lightning rod for change, I think, and how large organisations really do work beyond what might be ordinarily their clinical, academic or organisational boundaries. It's critical if you're going to take that seriously, right? So we know that by some metrics, the young UK has the most geographically unequal economy in the developed world. And the government's levelling up agenda is underscored by the fact that that regional inequality hasn't really changed since the 1900s. Really, it's relatively unchanged. And if we did a piece of work, it's not yet published, just finalising it now, but looking at the last 15 years of national interventions to support what might be called levelling up. And it shows that we've created an average of 0 impact on relative deprivation in the poorest local areas. And instead of sort of getting depressed by that, you know, there are pockets of excellence and change, but where you do, what we see is that where you see more relative positive impact, you do see sort of higher degrees of community involvement or community centeredness at the part of that. And at the sort of biggest level, if we're going to see 170 billion pounds worth of infrastructure and kind of levelling up funding flowing across the UK, it's not just about money then, isn't it? It's about one hypothesis would be to say, how do we work together in local places to ensure that we understand the effects of deeper understanding, involvement and innovation with local communities and placing them at the heart. Now, that's of course incredibly easy to say, and we all know, those of us that have been on the ground in various different organisations and communities, that it's complex and messy and interactive and social, and it's hard work and it's higher risk sometimes. But if I think about some of the new networks, the new community leaders, the new channels, the new capacity that were kind of inadvertent, but necessarily sort of the result of COVID and institutions working more deliberately with sort of just much more amorphous kind of groups of people doing things, that really feels like that should be better understood, not at a macro level, although that's important, but how are we collectively in our places reflecting on what's happened there together, and then kind of scaffolding and supporting that kind of emergent relationship in a way that does support things, perhaps like when the ICS flows and those sorts of other things that really do command and demand you to be more directly and more equitably involving just ordinary people who sit outside your places.
It's such a strong point, isn't it, Helen? And you're right, actually, universities and the NHS, we're not just bystanders to this levelling up agenda. Oh, you know, we are part of the intellectual debate we need to have, and you mentioned the regional inequalities, how they haven't progressed, and we need to be part of the delivery of making change to people's lives. So it's a fantastic sort of, you know, gauntlet you're throwing down to us, actually, Helen. It's not just for the politicians this to talk. We are on the front line. If I can just bring up the results of that poll, so huge push on collaboration and co-development. inclusivity coming across very strongly. Then we've got anchor institutions and building the future and measuring impact. And then case studies. And the case studies is something which we can bring to life. I think you're absolutely like putting it into practice actually is about some of those. So that's thanks for that second poll. We're going to touch on the integrated care system. It wouldn't be a conversation, would it, Jackie, with NHS colleagues without talking about restructures or new forms of governance. Now, before I bring Jackie in to talk about how this work sits with integrated care systems, we've actually got a question, a question on the polls for this audience, which is predominantly a university audience. It'd be fascinating to see the answer, about how much you know about your local integrated care system. So if we can just bring that question up and get people to give us a sort of sliding scale answer 1 to 5, and then that will appear any second now. And integrated care systems, of course, differ in size and scale, and Jackie's part of a quite simply an enormous one that stretches across the northeast and North Cumbria, whereas Fazana will be part of one which is northeast London. Shirley, you'll be part of one which is West Yorkshire and Harrogate. So we're just bringing the poll up before I bring Jackie in to talk about actually how we embed this work in the new structures, which is really important because we spoke about the need to influence national policy. Just wait for this third poll to come up through the magic of, there we go, perfect. So how much do you know about your local, we can get rid of the term in NHS because it should be a health and care, integrated care system. And you can be perfectly honest, if it's nothing, that's absolutely fine. If you're involved in a development, well, that's absolutely wonderful. Jackie, how this came up in our discussion, Jackie, it came up in both, how can we have and make sure this voice is heard in the governance that we're setting up? And it came up in that way about actually, if an integrated care system is about working together more collaboratively, how can we bring in, multiple partners into this space? I just wonder about your response to Ingrid's question, which is absolutely one which many parts of the leaders in pretty much every part of England will be reflecting on at this moment.
So yeah, this is here and now, isn't it? I've got really mixed feelings about the kind of the future. On the one hand, I feel massively optimistic because it's definitely the right model. But on the other, I worry that as in so many reorganisations, we just focus so much on the hierarchy and governance and structures. And if we do that, we'll fail. But I think if we can, and even in we are the largest, I think, system, I think we are in the country. Because we're big geography, but right from kind of Cumbria through Northumbria, Newcastle, right down to the Yorkshire, the boundary with North Yorkshire. So it is quite large. But already I can see that we can work both horizontally across on big issues, like workforce, etc. And digital, connecting, we're working on something called the Great North Care Record. So we've got connectivity right the way across and right the way through and down to general practice. I mean, what a fantastic instrument for change that will be over time for things like population health management. But I think we're going to have to nuance this because those place-based conversations are probably, in my view, more important than the ones we'll have across the top of the ICS together. But I think it's, I loved Helen's description of building scaffolding to support it. At the end of the day, this is all about relationships. Whether you're working across on big collaborations, which are quite complex and involve multiple partners, or you're working deep into place, again, lots of partners, but trying to think about what the vehicles for change are. So I noticed there's a question about that. And I think we can be quite inventive. A lot of our work in places feels more like a social movement. And I love that. It's not particularly hierarchical. So I'm hoping in this next change, we can avoid getting bogged down in structures and rules and get, it needs to be much more organic than that. But I think we need to get much more savvy, Michael, at dealing with, I'm learning a lot about having to work as much with the Treasury as I do with the Department of Health. Because that, if we're going to influence this government, and it looks like they're going to be here for a little while, so, we're going to have to play to their agenda, which is actually about that big joined-up conversation about health, wealth and well-being. So I hope that's helpful.
And I suppose experiences are different, aren't they, Jackie, in different parts of the country on this issue, but that those principles absolutely blend, blow through this agenda. Surely, in Yorkshire there is because one question NHS colleagues might have is, well, how are universities working together? And Yorkshire universities, I guess, is an example of that, isn't it, Shirley? And what's your experience in Yorkshire universities of bringing a collaborative relationship with integrated care systems and wider NHS partners?
Yeah, the role of regional university networks, I think, is going to be increasingly important, because I think what people are used to is University X, approaching an NHS partner to do a programme, and University B, C and D are also approaching them to do either similar or different things. And so I think it's really important that as universities, we can identify our regional priorities, how we can individually and collectively work on those. And that makes it much easier for co-design and co-creation. So what we're doing in Yorkshire is trying to identify with our local authority leaders, the CEOs, that is, of the local authority, and our ICS partners, which of the things the universities feel collectively we can all deliver on, and which ones will we do individually. So green energy and carbon zero is one of the ones that we're going to be working on collectively, and workforce is one of the others, NHS workforce. So we've got a few early programs in train that we're working on as a university network, which we need to push on. But I really appreciate what Jackie said about the complexity, because over the years I've sat in so many meetings about, say, workforce or research, and I keep thinking, how am I going to keep everybody appraised of all of this in my own organisation? So how are all of the universities and all of the NHS trusts and social work, social care, social work partners all going to be able to understand their role in what I hope is going to be a very significantly different way of working? And definitely you need to think about subsidiarity, and place-based approaches need to be very strongly reflected in whatever mechanisms are put in place.
Thanks, Shirley. Can I bring up the response to the last question we asked, please? Right, well, so that set us a challenge, I think, hasn't? And I think it's fascinating that, and it's 14% heavily involved in it, that there is something fascinating about, often we don't, we might watch regulatory change or other forms of changing another sector, and we might see the read what's in the front page of the paper, but actually how are we going to our local partners? So how is the NHS bringing our local partners, not just universities, into the conversations we're having, knowing this supports us, and how do we have that strength of partnership where if I'm in a university and I see the initials RCS on a board paper and I think, what on earth is this? I feel confident enough to ask that question. And I think that part of place relationship really brings that in. Fazana, primary care coming together in new ways, and you're yourself having to work at the different levels within the NHS. How, and if we're looking at, for example, maybe capital bills, we're looking at the future of health and care being actually more in the community, more community focused. What are the top issues which could bind primary care and universities going forward?
I think, Michael, this is not an easy question to answer, is it? None of this is easy, but the strength is in the fact that primary care works with our communities. That's the absolute strength, because the shared purpose, the shared goals, is to make, well, for me, looking at it from a health angle, but the widest, health being so much more than just whether you're on tablets and what diseases you have or don't have. And I think that, as I say, I think one of the huge learnings from COVID and this horrible time that we're experiencing and have been in is that there is no other option but to work together. And this is a real opportunity. Ultimately, a bit like Jackie, I'm less bothered about what the ICS regulations say. Obviously we all need to feed a beast, but it's far more important for me to show the work, as Helen says, to get down and to see what worked, what didn't work, why didn't it work? Is there something I'm missing? It is all about, how do relationships form? Relationships formed by one party trying to understand the other. Honestly, Michael, if you asked me what difficulties do our university partners have at the moment, I wouldn't be able to tell you. So the only way we will know that is by talking to each other. Why would our university partners, 40% of them, know what an ICS is? There's lots of doctors and nurses who don't know what an ICS is. We'll only know that by talking together. But I don't want to move away from the reason behind this. And the reason behind this is not about what our latest structure is called, and whether we're PCNs or ICSs or any other three-letter acronym name. It's about how we improve care and health in the wider sense for our communities. And as Helen says, since 1900, we know that in our deprived areas, mortality, so women in deprived areas are dying 10 years younger than they were before the Marmot report. That's just wrong. That's something that we need to and have to change. We're in 2021. So I think if we have that sort of purpose, and as Jackie keeps talking about the sticky edges, I love that. I can hear how much intention there is. And I think if we've got the intention to do it, and we know that we want to improve care, and we're on the ground, we can do it.
Thanks, Azana. It's a great reminder that when you're developing anchor networks, which many parts of the country are, is primary care involved? Over 90% of the interactions, huge roots in a community. It's that reminder for us, is where, if we're looking at anchors, it's not just the big shiny gleaming buildings, is it? It's the parts of our service which can work together and reflect what's happening on the ground. There's a question, Helen, come in about, we're talking about being more people sensitive, and we're talking about being more equitable, more inclusive. And yet, actually, there's still probably some of those age-old problems. Is our public patient involvement meaningful? Is it citizen-focused? And this could well be a part of, as we focus on the governance, we actually neglect the communities and how we operate and how we interact with citizens. I'm just wondering, what is that top tip or that first step we can take to say, if our governance doesn't talk about and understand the lives and what it might do for citizens, then it's not real, is it? We failed. As we move towards a governance conversations, how can we bring that engagement, that community engagement with us, and make sure that it's shaping how we organise ourselves, and we're not retrospectively trying to fit it in?
Well, there are obviously, there are lots and lots of methods and ways in which you can meaningfully and in sustained ways, not just listen to, but also work with people in communities, and recognise that there is regenerative power that sits in a place in a community. It's not just there is an asset-based approach to some of our work with communities as much as a deficit model. I think one of the things that it is incredibly easy to get locked into those high-level macro conversations about big strategic change, because that's where big influence and power can be exerted for change. The point is that, and that's not to decry the strategic powers of that kind of the general atop of the hill, but you just have to be also in the field and making some small changes. So if you've got a new relationship that you want to test out with a further education and university, or whatever kind of sort of cross-sector or cross-organisational partnership it is, as long as you've got a shared vision unfetter yourselves or get a mandate for being able to experiment, do some little things, reflect that back, but just make sure that there's that loop that takes you back from frontline work into the strategic, and there's a recognition of the respect of the experiences and the stories of the people who are both on the front line and in the communities. And I think it is there, but it's not exactly, John is saying in the comment, experiment, and don't be afraid of sort of doing something quite small, even if you're in the midst of this big, massive, strategic, systemic issue. As long as there are learning channels, you'll put forward one foot in front of the other, and bring, in terms of inclusivity, bring many, many more people along that journey through that, I think. So, I mean, whether the role of the Confederation or the Civic University Network is to sort of help those methods and competencies and leadership capability arise both outside institutions as well as within, I think is an open question. But to me, I mean, as you say, you can have all of the structures and new regulations in the world. We've had Social Value Act since 2000 and whenever it was 13. We've had the localism since 2011. It isn't always the sort of the proffering of a new system or a new piece of legislation or regulation that creates the change. It might create some change, but not the spirit of change. That's only really achieved through, as Jackie, I think, said, broad, deep, relational practice, which doesn't
Thanks,
sound, yeah.
And that brings us onto the point of subsidiarity, which I think Shirley Fazana spoke about, which actually, the places where things feel real, don't it, for our communities. There's a question which I think is probably more a challenge actually for us, which is, hearing from cities is important, but how, I think when we bring our case studies to bear in our reports, we need to reflect what this feels like in the range of places, whether urban or rural, metropolitan, places with several partners around the table, and the challenges. We'll bring that to life in the report. That's something we'll take with us. I want to pick up on a point, Jackie, that's in the questions, which I think is particularly relevant. And you speak about, your relationship with the council and about understanding the health and wealth links and well-being and how important they are, and your experiences in Newcastle have actually of almost seeing your part of your job is to pitch Newcastle as a place for inward investment, as a place to do business, because that helps you and your communities. It sounds like we're in a recession now, where the public sector is probably ever more influential in the development of our place from a wealth perspective and a health perspective. How can we connect the investment arm locally with actually making sure that this investment coming in improves health and well-being? How do we join that link?
So in multiple ways, probably, Michael. We had what we call a City Futures Board yesterday, and I think this leads in. So it's our health and wellbeing board, really. So it's publicly facing. You can get on YouTube and listen to all the leaders in the city talking, and we were talking about life right now, life in the next few months after COVID, and I was really interested in some of the views from local business, to hear about, I think we've got the largest, I don't know what the technical term is, but, we've got the most kind of pavement and street cafes and, I think anywhere in the UK, I don't know how we measure that, but, it's burgeoning. It's just, and you can see when you walk into the middle of Newcastle, you can see, we're just using so much more of that outside space, which is fantastic for those local businesses, but also for, many of the older age group who were saying, we're still feeling pretty vulnerable. We don't really want to go inside to have a meal. What we've done is made it as easy as possible for those local businesses to continue. And actually the view was probably they're doing more business than they were. But then we also had a debate about public transport and how we now need to work together to give people confidence that it's safe. And actually, if we don't go back to using that well, we might lose it, and that's got knock-on consequences for things like air quality and pollution, which in terms of health just gives us more problems down the line. So it was a really good example in a kind of goldfish bowl in Newcastle of so many ideas that were just fusion points. And it was really kind of thumped it home to me about needing to get a good narrative. So we've talked a lot about, how do you permeate through it, the rule of thumb is you need to say things at least 7 times before they're really heard. So how do you create a really compelling story, which for all our communities can be seen from space and heard from space, but that can also be meaningful in place? So you've got to do a lot of translation, a lot of building it and trying to work on ways to tell it. But then you've got to do a heck of a lot to actually make it stick in very local communities and make it meaningful for their lives. So yeah, I mean, this is just a lifetime's work, isn't it? And I loved Helen, again, I think Helen's example of just start somewhere small. This is about creating very visible examples of just what working differently can do. And just while I've got the kind of floor, the role of innovation as well. We've not talked much about that, but particularly in the digital and data science space, it's going to be really, really important we develop capability in our hospitals, universities, in our communities to use things like artificial intelligence to work out some of the complexities in these systems and help us do the right thing.
Building on that, Shirley, we've spoken already about how the NHS needs to bring in the university voice into our agenda now, integrated care systems, health, health and well-being. We're now seeing health becoming, I think, a much more explicit part of economic and inclusive growth too, locally, which is an issue which universities have been closer to than the NHS. When you're looking at whatever the future of the government's R&D roadmap, etc. How, is there a clear role there for universities to bring the NHS into these conversations? Because these may not go across Jackie's or Fazana's desk. We may not know about the nuance and the direction of what's needed. Is that a clear partner role for universities?
Oh, absolutely. And I think where you look at evidence where there's been strong research that has come about through partnerships with the NHS and universities, it's had significant impact and it has led to innovation. So in terms of smart cities, innovations in green and in digital tech, a lot of those impacts have been through partnership research. So what you need to be doing is having shared strategic objectives, but you also need shared delivery plans. So it's really making sure that the organisations are acting, to use the NHS term, as one, and it's not left to, not so much to chance, but to being successful in pockets. I think we can be more impactful with the resources we've got if we're planning together from the beginning. And I think the other key thing that we need to always link into this, going back to your earlier point, is inclusive growth is key. And whatever we're doing, we should be trying to drive inclusive growth. So integrated, connected planning. So when we're thinking about our economic recovery plans, well, how do we bring about the community engagement in that to understand what will be successful for inclusive growth, wherever that might be? And local authorities and hospitals and universities all need to be challenged on how they're engaging in that agenda, but definitely we should be working together. And I think we need to just be comfortable with the fact that universities might lead one agenda, NHS might lead another one, but ultimately the delivery's got to be co-designed and co-evaluated.
And whilst I've got you, Shirley, we had Effie in the room in our roundtables, an absolutely critical voice. We had a GP from Fleetwood who said his population most needed higher education, but were furthest away from higher education. So there's places where there aren't universities, and what can the NHS do about there? But there's also colleges, which we've seen with the recent, the FE white paper, huge focus on skills and links between colleges and employers. Such an important part of this jigsaw, aren't they, Shirley?
Oh, crucially, I mean, if you think about some of our towns, we might have previously said that they're underserved by, good quality healthcare or good quality education. They haven't got universities. They've got to travel a long way to get to certain things. But I think we need to reframe that and say we're underserving them. So how do we work together as the system to think about these other areas where, if we can make the enhance the skills levels and enhance the uptake and of care, that will lift up those areas that we have previously called underserved, but actually, as I said, that we have not provided for very well. And obviously investment needs to be driven into these areas as well.
Absolutely, and we will, and again, one issue for us to pick up in our report, I think, there, because that's going to be a huge issue. Helen, there's a question about, I guess, how we build. So the partnership working we've heard from Jackie Scherfers, it's fantastic, and it's often organic, isn't it? It might be driven by individuals or driven by local place needs. Taking it to the next level, and I suppose aligning the objectives. Maybe there's something about measurement here too. How can people take that step, which is actually coming up? We've all got our system metrics, which we are reporting to perhaps someone in London that actually may not be necessarily related to the success of our place. How can we build on an organic collection of partners to develop some of those objectives which matter to place?
Objectives or measurement is?
It could be, yeah.
So, I mean, there are some really interesting, obviously, models for how you can bring, developing a set of shared objectives is another relational task, and there are lots of different sort of methods and models for doing that. I was really intrigued by Jackie talking about that sort of kind of visibility of healthcare across the piece, and no doubt data and technology sort of helps with that. So I think the interesting piece, I mean, if I sort of look at, I'm actually going to just answer a question really, which is about measurement. So you've got say that you've got your objectives in place that are community informed, if not community created. We've created all sorts of different kind of metrics and objectives with communities and, say, property developers or local councils. But if you've got a way of bringing in that community voice and validating that as a metric, that's fine. But I would just sort of, the point that perhaps I want to make is that there are at least 10, probably 100, if I know of 10, different indices for trying to track kind of different kinds of community strength, well-being, prosperity, inclusive economy. And I think there's definitely a pragmatic part of me, which is like, when you're in place, use the metrics of what work for you, but also ensure that you've got a legitimate kind of community voice in there as well. But I'm one of the big questions I have at the moment is whether there is a common set of objectives or a common index for measuring these things, or actually at a sort of ground level, it's always a bit of, yes, we can look at our metrics, we can look at our objectives, we can measure how far we're reaching those objectives to some degree, but it's not there is something slightly ineffable about it, about whether you feel working, whether the community feels that it's working for them. A slightly response, sorry.
Well, I guess you're absolutely right. It's how you feel is such a emotive, but that's almost the acid test, isn't it, of what you're talking about. Before I bring Fazana in, talking about students, Jackie, how, you've set up your governance in Collaborative Newcastle, but you and Pat and Professor Chris, they're very clear to say this came later. This certainly wasn't the first step we took. How did you make that step? At what point in your journey did you think we now need to almost nail a bit of this down and make it, formalize it in some ways?
It definitely did come later. And as you say, we didn't start it. And I think when we realized that actually it could be a mechanism to go even further. So, the big complex organizations, so we've actually formalized a lot of the kind of governance and leadership structures, but not just at the level of Pat and Chris and I. I've got a team, a shared leadership team that works with leaders in general practice, leaders in mental health and social care. They happen to be based in one of our buildings. They work with shared information and tools to help them do what they do in place. And we've invested in things like, we've got a joint leadership program, which is now, I think we've had 6 cohorts of leaders. So some of that helps us to helps us to move some of those things along. Or, recently with the shift in commissioning that the new changes to system working will bring, it allows some of that governance and infrastructure, allows us to pull money and pull budgets, or get more devolved primary care budgets to support general practice. So it's got to have a purpose, I think, not just built for building its sake.
And Shirley, can I just quickly come a very practical question? Because one of the parts of this work was almost to reconnect, perhaps where it needs reconnecting. As a leader, as a vice chancellor, how often are you speaking to your NHS equivalents?
Probably at least every week, if not more. So we have I sit on the people board for our ICS. And I chair the Bradford Health and Social Care Economic Partnership, which is designed to really focus on increasing workforce and all that goes with that. And we have a strategy group which the Chief Executive of the local authority chairs, which is the senior leadership group across the city region. So that has all of the NHS leaders on it, and myself and people from FE, fire, police, etc. And we found that forum has been extremely helpful in us being able to be agile and making decisions that we can all sign up to very, very quickly without going through numerous iterations of meetings and papers. And that's helped us to better connect with the Health and Wellbeing Board. So I think a strong connection to the region's health and wellbeing boards through universities and NHS and social care partners can cut through a lot of the layers of bureaucracy to make us be much more agile. But I think the other thing that I would say about the relationships is they're happening at every level. And so you've got relationships that are, how do we find more practice placements? How do we build upon our research assets? How do we find somewhere to host a vaccination centre? How do we set off a new apprenticeship programme? What are we going to do about genomics, etc.? And you could go on forever and ever. And there is something about trying to understand how the relationships at every level how they work. And I know that it definitely is the people thing that's important, but they need to be supported to feel confident to get on and do things. So whilst we can cut through at a senior level, we've got to help our colleagues to be able to cut through things at every level in our organisations.
Thanks. I just saw that personal reflections actually of how often we as leaders interact is so important in setting a culture of a place in your institution, isn't it? Fazana, one group of our populations we haven't spoken about today, but critical for everyone joining, are of course the students locally. And I recall talking to one of your colleagues who joined one of the roundtables from Leicester, particularly strong university city, speaking about occasionally it's difficult because the students may not appear on a local, if we're looking at a population health view of our place, the students may not feature on that. They may be registered in different, in their hometowns, etc. So she felt it was quite difficult sometimes as a primary care leader to understand the needs of this community, which is an incredibly important community. And I suppose you'll have a similar in Newham with, Queen Mary's nearby, a large university. How might we ensure that in the work we do, we reconnect the students into that population health prism through which primary care are looking at?
Yeah, I think this is a real issue, and I think those that look after huge populations of students do find that a lot of the again, when we're talking about measurement, it was really nice what Helen was saying, because we often choose metrics that are easy to measure, not necessarily the most relevant, in general practice we do find that a lot of our metrics are more geared toward our sort of maybe elderly or really sick population. and are we serving the needs of our students, you know, who are younger and fit, but often have huge mental health needs, you know, sexual health needs. So I think we do need to do more around that. And I think, again, having primary care networks, I mean, what I love about primary care networks is that it is all about delivery, and it is all about being close enough. So having that flexibility to think this is my population, we could do, and our needs may be different. We still got some work to do, though, Michael, around that collaboration and co-development, whether we're talking about this in a, you know, civic university sense or just our populations. I think there's still some work for primary care networks to work with our populations when we're co-designing, rather than, you know, have the engagement as an afterthought. So I think that cuts across whatever conversation we're having with partners. But again, I think we're thinking about it, and the reason this is important is also that if we could encourage our students to stay, obviously that's really good for investment in our area. So again, where I am in Newham in East London, you know, we've got a huge GP recruitment shortage, yet we've got wonderful medical schools around the corner. What can we do to get those people to stay?
Yeah, absolutely right, Fizona. Helen, I'm going to bring up, before I give you the very last comment, I'm going to bring up the last, or ask the team to bring up the last question, which is effectively us asking people on the call if they'd be interested in taking part in regional or thematic roundtables. Hopefully that's a yes, but please do answer that. Helen, I was really struck during the roundtables where actually often we can speak about community engagement as if it's a one-off thing. And I think you absolutely referenced the point in the conversation we had previously about how are we sense checking at every, you know, routinely at every step of the way? How are we maintaining that ongoing relationship with communities and not just saying we've done it, that's great?
Well, that gets the heart of what you believe you can do with the communities. If you think your job is to primarily just to consult and listen, then your job is sort of going back and ensuring that you're sense checking all the time. If your job is to think about, well, how do I mobilise the third sector, community groups, local charities, local social enterprises in the endeavour that I have, then it's more about, well, what are the ways in which we can either work together or work in concert? Because the best kinds of relationships are not transactional. It's where if anyone's tried to forge a partnership, it's when, well, let's work on something together and we'll learn how to work together. So I think it's recognising that from kind of consultation through to full scale co-production and everything in between, there are many different modes and models for working either collaboratively or with sort of less sort of constituted or institutionalized groups. So I would say pick a project and work on it and recognize there are assets that are beyond your walls.
Wonderful. Well, thanks. Well, I hope people who joined have really enjoyed this past hour and a bit for me. Oh, there you go. People want to get engaged. That's fantastic. We will no doubt be in touch, and it's been an absolute pleasure. And thanks to Dame Jackie, to Shirley, to Fizona, to Helen for what has been a fantastic conversation. We do want your case studies. We do want to know if there's any issues that we actually should blend into our report. We do want you to be involved in this work. You know, you have to live this work locally. We can draft a report. It has to be lived locally by leaders. My very final point is you will see a poll will pop up, another poll popping up in your screen in a minute with just one question to answer. Really appreciate your feedback. If you can engage on Twitter, of course, keep using your hashtags and your handles, visit the place space on the Padlet, access all the resources in the members area, and just again, another huge thanks to me, thanks to the panel. What a fantastic conversation. Thanks to you for joining. Please do be in touch, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you, Michael.